Good afternoon, good afternoon, good afternoon. Imagine two men are fighting in a very, very remote area. One of them survives and the other does not make it. And then the survivor comes and tells you that the fighting was so brutal. It got to an extent that he he might have thrown some jabs on on the guy that didn't make it. He threw some jabs and did all this and did all this. All those that are listening would probably applaud the guy that survived as a hero on how he managed to conquer on this man that is succumbed. And he might even tell a tale of exactly what happened and even probably where his body was downed. And all the people in the world, the only version of truth that they will have, it is the version of the truth of the man that survived. Whether in reality it was an actual fight, nobody will ever know. Maybe he might be inventing something because these days people are master inventors. Maybe whilst they were on the way to where the fight was to be staged, a lion pounced on them and he managed to run away and leave the other men for dead. But you'll never know those. So the question that we have to ask ourselves, could there be such way how we view things in the world? As I was driving yesterday, I saw a man who's trying to advertise his real estate business. He says, since all the big companies started in a garage, he's talking of the Amazon, he's talking of Google, he's talking of Apple, and quite a number of companies that their founders say they were started in a garage. And he says, if you want to be successful, just have a garage. Just because he's selling garages, he says, if you want to be successful, like the Amazons of this world, have a garage. I was inclined to call the man and say, do you know what? I do have a garage, but I'm not yet successful. Meaning, the reasons why Amazon is so successful is not because they started working in a garage. How many stories of similar companies that started at the same time as Amazon or who started earlier than Amazon, probably who wanted to do the same thing as Amazon, that never survived and nobody will ever know about them? Like that man, his version of events were buried with him wherever he was buried. It might turns out that he was set up after all, but the one who's telling the history is telling from his vantage point, and people will only know that version of the events. So I also happened the other day, I was in Cape Town with a few acquaintances. When we, after a hard day's labor, we decided to go and look for something to munch. Whilst we were looking for something to munch, it was around 7 p.m. and the places around the waterfront generally get so busy. So all those restaurants, when you approach them around a certain time, all of them, they look so successful. I even called my wife and said, my wife, do you know what? We've been thinking of starting a business. Maybe this restaurant business that we wanted to start, we could come and start it here in Cape Town. Business is booming. Business is booming. And then something hit me that the reality is there are things that are missing in this whole equation. Actually, I am missing the missing. There are restaurants that have started that once launched in that area and they were not so successful and they had to fold. Probably some of them they had to liquidate within 1 to 2 years. But because they are not there, it only remains those restaurants that are so successful. And now somebody believes that if you were to locate your restaurant there, you will be as successful as these successful restaurants. But the truth of the matter, it is not so true. Which brings me to my point of survivorship bias. Survivorship balance, actually, all of us, we are victims, and every day we suffer from survivorship bias. When we look at the things around us, we always consume the states that are actually collected from those that have survived, those that have made it. Because those that did not survive, their voice is buried 6 feet under. But it does not mean that whatever happened to them is not important. So when you are trying to study what one has to do to be successful at the waterfront as a restaurant owner, if you were to go and ask the people that are running the businesses today, you might think that this is the secret ingredient for success there. But they have never known failure. If you really want to know what you ought to do, the lessons that you can learn if you want to succeed there, probably need to find those that folded, those that failed to make it. But survivorship bias does not give you that luxury. The term survivorship bias itself made itself into the mainstream and popular culture around the Second World War. America with its allied forces versus Nazi Germany. At the time, there was a time that the Americans would dispatch their aircraft to wherever, whether to deliver some supplies to its troops on the ground, or even their military aircraft. So they were suffering some casualties, and some of the planes they never made it back to their bases. They were shot down, and some planes did survive. Those that survived, they would come with some bullet bullet holes in various places. So what they sought to do, they sought to reinforce the aircraft in the areas. They initially wanted to reinforce the aircraft in the areas that they were predominantly damaged. So they started collecting some of the data from all these planes that retained. And most of the planes that retained, they were either damaged around the wingspan or at the back, the tail, or somewhere around the fuselage. The initial conclusion could have been, since these planes, most of them, according to the heat map, suggest that these planes are being damaged in these areas, the logical conclusion would be, let's reinforce them there so that should the enemy decide to attack them there. And then a certain professor, whether a professor, researcher, or a statistician or mathematician, who used to work for a certain institute of applied mathematics or something like that, and his name is Abraham Wald. He asked the question to say, generals, these airplanes and the results of my studies simply say that the majority of the planes that are returning home, that can fly back home, they are damaged around these areas. But then, what conclusion can we come up with based on this data? After all, we are data driven. People always want to make decisions based on available data, some tangible facts. And I could imagine some people in that room as he was presenting his hypothesis or his findings. They would say, look, the areas where it seems the enemy is shooting the most, which are the areas highlighted by that heat map, those are the areas that we need reinforcement. Because after all, you could not reinforce the whole airplane. Otherwise, the plane would not even take off. It would be too heavy. So in an effort to try to make sure that the plane can still fly, but also reinforced to withstand the attack from the enemy, they had to find those vital points that they need to reinforce. I could then imagine somebody saying, no, 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 let's look at those places where the heat map shows that there are numerous bullet holes. But one thing that they did not know was the planes that retained, they retained home because they were shot at in those areas. But the planes that did not retain, probably they were shot in the areas that the heat map did not tell them. So once the findings were presented and Abraham what says, you are missing what is missing. Meaning the planes that have damaged, they contains crucial information that so they decided to reinforce on the areas that the heat map did not highlight as the most attacked areas. And that could and that was a masterstroke move and it changed the tide of the war. Having reinforced that, it meant that most of the planes that did not previously retain, now they had a realistic prospect of getting hit and surviving because of the reinforcement. So now think about things that happen around you. How many times do you make a decision, facts that are laid to you, and you think the facts they contain all the available scientific knowledge or whatever data that is crucial for decision making. But how many things that could potentially derail or help you survive that you don't know? There is a plenty. One day I spoke about Ndebele and Ndebele Boer War that happened in the areas of Pretoria that culminated in the Boer celebrating that we've defeated these Ndebeles, these trekkers, whatever they called them. At the same time, the Ndebeles thought that they'd achieved their mission of stealing the cattle because their mission initially was to steal the cattle, but the Boers, their mission was to defend the territory. So people had different perceptions of that war. Different, and history were to be told by the foot trekkers. Definitely, they would say we completely embarrassed those people. They just came with spears and nothing else. While least the Ndebeles would say we achieved our objective because our objective it was to steal the cattle. Right? So when we look at the things, when we look at the people that are successful, one of the things that people always say is let's look at the habits of the highly successful people. Somebody will list things like they jog every morning, they wake up early around 4 a.m., they start a book probably every day, they read a book before they sleep, and they meditate on this and that, they do this and that. And then we are fooled, we are woodwinked to think that if we do the same thing, probably we might be as successful as them. But what is missing is missing. What is the missing there? The missing is the people who have done this very same thing as the successful, but they were not so successful. And there is no statistics or data about them because they were not so successful. They were not so successful, so there is no data. Nobody knows that they exist, but in reality, they do exist. So now, when we try to copy and mimic the habits of these successful people, we think we are also going to be equally successful as them. And then, after toiling and toiling, you find that you cannot be successful. Why? It is because you've been fed a big fat lie, not intentional lie, but it is because most people, they are always looking for advice and they want to mimic those that they deem to be successful in their industries, not knowing the toil and the hardships that you need to go through. And the best person to teach you probably is the one who has failed, because he knows what made them fail. The ones that have succeeded don't have the understanding what makes one to fail, because they've never failed. They've never failed. So if you are missing something and you still want to reach a conclusion with so much information that is missing, know that you are suffering from survivorship bias. So think about things that you do where you are suffering from survivorship bias and find ways to circumvent the shortcomings. Thank you. Hello, Ash.
Hi, what's the issue number for this year?
Sorry?